Hello, everyone. Welcome to the April Crane Research Forum. My name is Janelle Williamson. I am the Administrative Coordinator here at Crane, and my colleague Kathy is monitoring our chat box and will be sending some housekeeping items here shortly. We are very excited to have you here today as our guests and continue our spring focus on Crane-specific research. And today I am pleased to welcome Dr. Kelly Purtell. Dr. Purtell is an Associate Professor of Human Development and Family Science in the College of Education and Human Ecology and a Faculty Fellow here at the Crane Center. Her research centers on understanding how contextual factors shape health and development among low-income children and adolescents, and on how policies and programs can enhance the developmental trajectories of these youth. Many of her current projects focus on policies and practices related to early childhood education and their influences on children's development. Kelly is here with us today to speak on understanding the transition to kindergarten and factors that influence it. Now I will turn my video off and turn it over to our speaker. Welcome, Dr. Purtell.
Thanks, Janelle, and thanks everyone for being here. I am really excited to talk to you all about this topic. As I was preparing this talk, I realized that the vast majority of the work that I've been doing through the Crane Center in recent years has been focused on this transition. And I know that there are many of you on the call today who maybe participated in this work or helped us with data collection. And so I'm really excited to be able to share back some of our results. A couple of notes about the talk today. I'm going to keep things pretty big picture. I am going to talk about the transition from multiple perspectives, both from systems and classrooms and also involving families. And so I'm happy to answer some more detailed questions in the chat after. Feel free to use the Q&A to send along some questions or to follow up with me sometime after the talk. The other caveat I want to make before we get going is that I'm going to talk about the kindergarten transition pre-COVID and pre-pandemic and the situation we're in. And I know that a lot of us are concerned about what this transition will look like for the upcoming fall. And so I'm happy to touch on that throughout my talk, and I'll also engage in questions on that during the Q&A. But to kind of give an overview of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to provide a little bit of background on why I think the kindergarten transition is important. My guess is that because you are here, you already agree with that, but I'll still talk about it briefly. I'm going to provide some data we have about how kids are doing during the kindergarten transition. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we know about how the experiences that kids have prior to kindergarten, how do those experiences shape their transition experiences. But then I'm going to spend most of the time talking about what practices do we know promote positive transitions, as well as what are some of the barriers to implementing those practices, and what can we do in the future to make the transition easier for children and their families. So before I get into anything, I want to start by giving an overview of the data that I'm going to be talking about today. So most of the data I'm talking about today comes from a large project called the Early Learning Network. And so the Crane Center at Ohio State is one of the sites for the Early Learning Network. This is a project funded by the US Department of Ed through their Education Research Institute. And there are a number of sites across the country. And we were all tasked to think about pre-K to grade 3, and in particular, children's learning environments throughout that time, with this focus on malleable factors. And what they mean there is, what are the things that we can change to promote positive learning environments and positive developmental environments for kids? And so within the Ohio site, we've done 3 studies as a part of this project. One was a qualitative study where we interviewed preschool and elementary school teachers and administrators, including principals, school board members, and superintendents in over 25 districts across Ohio. And in that study, we selected districts to maximize the diversity that we see in Ohio, both in terms of urban and rural, school size, demographics, things like that, to try to have a representative picture of what things look like from an early learning perspective in the state. We also did an in-depth study where we looked at what is going on in 180 pre-K to grade 3 classrooms here in Central Ohio. And so that involved a lot of observational work where people would go out to the classrooms and observe what children were experiencing. And I'll also present a little data from a longitudinal study where we're following over 700 kids from kindergarten through grade 3 to see how their experiences as well as their skills change over time. We also have some of those kids from pre-K all the way to grade 3. So that's going to be most of what I talk about today. But I'm also going to highlight other early learning network sites, and particularly where our findings converge with theirs or where it diverges. I'll do the same with some of the information that we have from nationally representative data coming both from elementary schools and Head Start programs across the country. And then I'll wrap up today talking about a new approach to family engagement that we've been implementing here in Ohio, designed to ease the transition to kindergarten for children and families. But to really get started, why is the transition important? So we know that the transition to kindergarten is a key time for children's development, particularly their development of skills that we know foster both school and really lifetime success. So these might be emergent literacy skills that are going to help them with reading comprehension. It might be self-regulation skills that allow them to pay attention in the classroom, and social development, the ability to make friends and to enjoy others around them. Back when I was an undergrad, we used to learn about this 5 to 7 shift, about the huge changes in cognitive development that were happening during around roughly the same time kids are entering elementary school. We also know from developmental science that transitions in and of themselves are always important. Transitions are always periods that have the potential to shape trajectories in the long term or to be turning points for children in their developmental trajectories. And we have lots of evidence that school transitions follow this pattern. We know that how kids do at the start of kindergarten is very predictive of how they do in later grades. We know that thinking about the middle school transition, that's a key, how that transition goes represents a key risk or resilience factor for whether or not kids eventually graduate high school. But I think that the transition to kindergarten is also really important because kids are coming from such varied experiences. So what I've depicted here is some kids might be in a pre-K classroom just down the hall from their kindergarten classroom, whereas other kids may have spent their entire time from birth to age 5 at home with their parents. They may be in Head Start. They might be in a private childcare that is still center-based and a little bit more like a classroom. Or they could be in some sort of family-based care, whether that's formal family-based care or a more informal arrangement with a neighbor or a relative. We also know that most kids have some combination of these experiences, not just one, and how long they have these experiences is varied. And so I think from a teacher's perspective, when you talk to kindergarten teachers, they're very aware of this and how that shapes what children bring to the kindergarten classroom. But what I'm going to talk about today is I think regardless of whatever those prior experiences are, the kindergarten classroom is a really different environment and represents a really big transition that kids have to make. And so with that, I'm going to move into our data on how are kids doing during the transition. And so when we were doing these interviews with teachers across the state, especially our interviews with kindergarten teachers, there was a consistent concern from kindergarten teachers about how children were doing in the transition. And from that, we realized that although there's a lot of research on children's kind of school readiness or specific academic skills at the start of kindergarten, we knew far less about the challenges that kids were facing. And so from that, we developed a survey measure that we gave to teachers in 45 classrooms. They reported on children in their classroom individually for a total of 688 children. This sample was primarily white. It was not as racially or ethnically diverse as we would want it to be. However, the sample was diverse in terms of socioeconomic status, with about half of our families having income for the year under $40,000 and less than a quarter of our families having a bachelor's degree or higher as the highest degree held by an adult in the household. And so teachers reported on 5 different challenges that children we thought might be likely to face in this transition. And so they asked about these particularly during the kindergarten transition. And so there's 5 different challenges that you can see on this figure. And a couple things I want to point out. For all of the challenges except following schedules, more children had at least a little difficulty than didn't have any difficulty. The exception there being following schedules, where over 60% of the kids were reported as having no difficulties by their teacher. 70% of kids had at least one challenge reported by their teacher, but these challenges were likely to co-occur, where over 30% of kids were reported as having challenges on all 5 of these items. So it tends to be if a child is struggling with one of these things, like following schedules or making friends, they were more likely to also be experiencing struggles with all of them. Boys were much more likely to be reported as having difficulties than girls. We also saw that children who had an IEP were reported as experiencing more challenges than their other classmates. We can think about how the transition is going from things like this. We could also think about it from readiness assessments. So in Ohio, we have the kindergarten readiness assessment. And in the most recent data of that, I think it was 2019, 40% of children were demonstrating readiness, whereas only 36% were approaching readiness and 23% were emerging, clearly showing that there seemed to be a mismatch between what skills children were bringing to the classroom and what they were expected to have at the start of kindergarten. So I want to briefly talk about children's prior experiences in the transition. So there's a large body of research that shows that kids who attend preschool enter kindergarten with higher levels of academic skills than their peers who did not attend preschool. These are typically on language measures, literacy measures, early math. We see this in our own data. Other early learning sites saw this, and it's been replicated in many studies across the country and even the world. But I want to point out that in terms of these challenges, these challenges that might represent challenges of adapting to the new classroom, we did not see any differences between kids who had attended preschool and kids who hadn't. And I think that that goes back to the point I was making earlier, that this represents a big shift for everyone. And so I'm going to talk about kind of 2 key aspects of this transition throughout today. The first is children's experiences in the classroom. And so I'm going to kind of present some data that aligns with this point that I keep making about the big shift. And then I'm going to talk about the the supports that we provide children and family to help them navigate this big transition. But before I get into those two specific aspects, I want to take a systems approach to talking about this. Um, and so the next few slides really come from things that we learned by talking to teachers and administrators across the state. And so based on those interviews, I would argue that preschool and elementary school are just fundamentally different systems, even when preschool is happening within the district. And there are a lot of reasons for this, but a main one is that early childhood education and preschool are often operated through programs like Head Start or through Jobs and Family Services, and they have their own regulatory systems. And then we move into elementary school, which falls under a completely different regulatory system, and that these differing systems lead teachers and administrators to have really differing orientations on what the classroom should look like, but also provides them with different opportunities in terms of which curriculum to use, what professional development is available. And because these systems are so disparate, it makes it harder to create alignment throughout this transition to kindergarten. So what do we know does happen to help ease this transition? In our interviews, people talked consistently about a number of transition programs. So using staggered starts to kindergarten, where only a third or half of the class attends the first few days of kindergarten. So kids and parents have more time to meet with teachers and start building connections. Preschools often do visits to kindergarten classrooms in the spring before kindergarten and hold resource nights to help prepare parents for this transition. School districts hold informational nights to help prepare teachers as well. And a couple of points I want to make about these practices is that, one, this aligns pretty closely with national data in terms of what are the most common kindergarten transition practices that we see. And they've been shown to be meaningful for how kids are doing during the kindergarten year. So I want to make it clear that I think these practices are important, and I hope that we continue to think about them in the future. But two things that came across when we were doing these interviews was that they felt a little bit like a light touch, and teachers didn't feel as though they necessarily had the space or support to really work to be building relationships across this connection. And with some exceptions, there wasn't a ton of in-depth cross-system efforts. So what I mean there is there wasn't a ton of work happening across preschools and elementary schools to provide transition supports. It was the preschool does these things and the elementary school does these things. And that was true when we looked at kind of other aspects of the ways that these systems might be interacting. So one thing that became apparent in our interviews was the challenge with even data sharing or using data across these two systems. And it was this bi-directional process. So to talk about it briefly, we saw that many kindergarten teachers or kindergarten principals did not have any data on how many of their kids actually attended a formal preschool environment in the year prior to kindergarten, let alone how they were doing in kindergarten. We also saw, and there were some teachers that really desired more data on that. We also saw other teachers who were provided data from children's preschool, but really didn't want to spend a lot of time paying attention to that data because they wanted their thoughts and beliefs about children to be influenced by the children when they entered in their classroom and to stay away from having preconceived notions. We also saw the reverse. Preschool teachers didn't have a lot of data on how their kids were doing once they went to kindergarten, whether it's on the readiness data or other more general markers of how they're doing. But we're really interested in having this data so they could think about what they were doing and what they might improve on to better prepare their children. And overall, we saw pretty scarce engagement across systems. And so when I say engagement, I really mean connections forming between preschool teachers and administrators and elementary school teachers and administrators. Um, and we did see slightly more connections and engagement when the district was offering pre-K, but there were still a lot of caveats and limits there. So in many districts in Ohio, preschool happens in separate buildings because there's not enough room in elementary school. So there's this geographical barrier. We also saw many districts have preschool classrooms in their building, but they're offered by different agencies, whether that's Head Start or an educational service center. So again, having kind of different operating agencies and regulations. And then other times it really was just kind of a historical legacy of preschool as something separate from elementary school. And so maybe curriculum planning was not happening with the pre-K and K teachers at the same time and things like that. And there's clear reasons why these systematic connections aren't happening. And I think there were a lot of barriers that are really easy to see that teachers and administrators talked about. So one, the early childhood education system is incredibly fragmented, right? We have Head Start programs, we have private programs, we have some school district programs, and the idea of elementary schools being able to connect to all of them is pretty overwhelming to think about. I mentioned these different regulations and pressures. So preschools are really focused in Ohio on their step up to quality rating. Elementary schools are really focused on making sure that they're teaching to the Ohio learning standards and preparing for the upcoming high stakes testing in third grade. And so they're experiencing different pressures that are kind of shaping the way that they approach working with children in the classroom. And then there's also just logistical barriers, right? When do preschool teachers and elementary school teachers have time to connect given all of the other things on their plate? How do we get them in the same room and give them time to really think about how they might work together on the kindergarten transition? But I want to kind of leave the systems talk on a more positive note and say we do have explicit policies and procedures that help promote positive transitions. And two of them are kind of long-standing. So Head Start has always, or at least for a very long time, had an avowed focus on helping kids through the kindergarten transition. The IDEA Act has done a lot to improve transitions for children with IEPs. So when we talk to teachers about how they support kids during the transition, almost universally teachers would talk about, well, we do these things, but they're fairly limited. And they would say, except for our kids who have an IEP. And because of the IDEA Act, they got much more intensive support, typically including meetings that included their preschool teachers, their elementary teachers, and the child's parents. But we also kind of have a new policy lever that I think is going to help us think about these cross-system connections, and that is the newest reauthorization of ESSA, or the Every Student Succeeds Act. That's ACT, not ACTS. And this act is the legislation at the federal level for elementary and secondary schooling. But in its newest reauthorization, there's an explicit focus on transitions, and especially the kindergarten transition, and building connections between Head Start programs and elementary schools. And so states are starting to implement various programs. I know Ohio has an exciting conference coming up on this topic. And I think that through this act and through this new focus on the transition, we'll hopefully be able to build out connections as well as generate new ideas on ways to approach this transition. I'm gonna switch gears a little bit and talk about what kids' experiences in the classroom look like moving from preschool to kindergarten. And so I talked about how these systems operate differently. And I think one of the ways that that translates is to then what do the classrooms look like in preschool and elementary school? And so this comes from our observational study, where we really wanted to understand what our kids' experiences in preschool, kindergarten, and we also compared to first grade in this study. And so we went in and did two observations of 120 pre-K, kindergarten, and first grade classrooms in Central Ohio. And today I'm going to talk about what we saw in terms of grouping practices, types of instruction, and time and academic content. And so I'm going to show a few slides that this is kind of the percentage of time that we saw in different things. And so on this slide, this is about grouping practices. And so I'm just going to point out a couple things. So if you look at the darkest green, what we see is pre-K kids spend less time in whole class instruction than kindergarten and first grade kids do. And they also spend less time looking at the almost lightest green. They also spend less time in individual learning, which might be sitting at a desk by themselves or potentially sitting in an area of the preschool classroom working on something on their own. And then kind of conversely, we see that pre-K kids are more likely to be spending time in small groups. One of the things that I really notice when I look at these figures is how much more similar kindergarten looks to first grade than it does to pre-K. This slide is a little bit busier, so I'm going to again point out just a few things. This is looking at kind of the type of instruction or method of instruction that was being used during the time. And what you can see is pre-K kids were in kind of direct teacher-led instruction 16% of the time, but this was up to 25% of the time, both for kindergarten and first grade classrooms. Using centers as an instructional strategy was much more prevalent in pre-K than it was in kindergarten. And then we started to see newer things emerge. So in kind of the lime green, you can see we observed worksheets being used in pre-K classrooms 2% of the time, but that was up to 11% of the time in kindergarten. And lastly, the amount of academic content. So what you can see here is that kindergarten and first grade classrooms spend a large proportion of time on literacy and language. It is much higher than pre-K, but it's also much higher than any other subject that they're focusing on. I will say in this version of our coding scheme, we were not able to code out the academic focus of centers that were being used in pre-K and a little bit in kindergarten. And so this might be an underestimate of the amount of academic content that kids were getting in pre-K. We've tried to further refine this coding system so that we can get some of that academic content out. But unfortunately, that was one of our data collections that got paused during COVID. So I don't have great data on that yet. So before I move on, I want to make 2 points. One, aligns with evidence from across the country that kindergarten is more academically oriented than ever before, which might make the transition to kindergarten harder and a more stark contrast than ever before. I'm not here to argue that these classrooms, that kindergarten needs to look more like pre-K or vice versa, but I do think that we need to think really hard about how can we make them somewhat more aligned in ways that can support children. I'll also note that this is consistent from some of our sister sites for the Early Learning Network. And so one paper in particular focused on comparing district-based pre-K programs to community-based pre-K programs and kindergarten classrooms. And they found that both sets of pre-K classrooms looked quite similar, and both of them looked quite different from the kindergarten classrooms. I do want to acknowledge that even though I'm arguing that more alignment across classroom experiences for kids would make the transition to kindergarten better and easier for kids and families. We don't have great data supporting that yet. And so I'm hoping in the next few years to see more people tackling this question. But if we assume that there are some going to be positive benefits to it, I think it leads us to this question of, well, how do we do that? So there's this notion that people are talking about a lot now of vertical alignment, where horizontal alignment is making sure the things we do within grade, our assessments, our curricula, our practices are all aligned. But then how do we do that work across grades? And one example from the Early Learning Network of an area that's trying to do this is Boston. And they have developed this program called Focus on Early Learning, where they're explicitly focusing on increasing the vertical alignment from pre-K to second grade in their school district. And one of the things I find interesting about their approach is that they're explicitly trying to increase some of these instructional strategies that are common in pre-kindergarten in kindergarten through second grade. And in particular, they're focused on increasing the amount of small group time and increasing the use of centers as a learning strategy. And they've invested a lot in this and done a lot of work to kind of bring these systems together. But some of the early descriptive work is showing that they're still facing challenges too. One of them, for example, is the elementary school teachers feeling like they have way too much to do. They're trying to meet the standards and the other things that they need to do for elementary school and incorporating these other things. And so we need systems working together, but it's still not necessarily an easy process. I'm going to make one last big transition, and I really want to talk about the family piece. So what we're seeing in our data and others is that this is a big shift that kids are making. And I think that we need to think about how do we maybe make that shift a little smoother, but I also think we need to be thinking about how are we helping kids and families prepare and then move through this transition. And so one of the ways we've been thinking about this is how do we increase the connections between families and schools during the transition? And we've been thinking about this because we think that there are a lot of positive benefits that may emerge, and there's research to suggest that that's true. So if there's more alignment between expectations between home and school environments, that will make it easier for kids. If there's more connections, it becomes easier for parents and teachers to talk to each other about issues that children may be having. And it also can increase the amount of positive interactions, not just among adults, but that children are having with the adults in their lives. And so how do we do this? Our approach was to start building these connections prior to kindergarten. In particular, we're starting the start of the year prior to kindergarten. We had an explicit focus on building communication and relationships across everyone involved in the children's transition. So their preschool teachers, their elementary school teachers, certainly their parents, but also their community as a whole. And thinking about what are the ways that we can promote continuity in environments across this transition. And so the program we developed really has two separate components. This first one is kind of what we call the preschool classroom component. And this is where we worked with preschool teachers. And we worked to help them develop and engage parents in activities designed to prepare for the transition. So maybe it's holding some of these transition nights or doing other parent and child involved activities that can help build community among parents. We also help them increase their communication through new newsletters to be sent home to parents. And we also helped them think about what could they be doing in their classroom, particularly in the spring prior to kindergarten, to help kids prepare. So doing storybook readings where books are focused on kindergarten or the transition, setting up visits to local elementary schools, or even creating playgroups with children who are going to be attending the same elementary school the next year. So kids can start to at least have continuity of peers in terms of this transition. The other piece of this was direct work we were doing with families. So how do we engage families through home visiting? We developed a program that provides 9 home visits from the start of the preschool year through the middle of the kindergarten year. So they are about once every other month, and they're focused on building connections. So home visiting programs have shown a lot of success, and many of them in the literature focus on how to help parents build kids' skills. And we do a little bit of that in these home visits, but we focus much more on helping prepare parents and their children for building connections, both while they're in preschool, but also as they transition to elementary school. And the same people doing these home visits are the people working with preschool teachers to help facilitate connections that way. When we talk about family engagement, we really are talking about a bi-directional process. It's not just up to parents to be involved, but it's really this bi-directional process between families and schools to come together to help children navigate schooling and especially navigate this transition. We really tried in this program to help families who traditionally face barriers to engagement increase their level of engagement. And so some of these barriers are logistical. Maybe it's time. Families where parents are working second or third shift jobs face a lot more challenges getting to event designed to help them enroll their kids in kindergarten, for example. Transportation issues. We also know that there are clear documented racial and linguistic challenges. Parents from minoritized groups in our country face more challenges building relationship with their children's teachers. There's also linguistic barriers. And I want to note that these challenges are more heightened at the transition to kindergarten than they are in preschool, in part because the ECE workforce is more diverse than the elementary school workforce. So a child and a parent's odds of working with a teacher from the same cultural or linguistic background as them is much higher in preschool than it is in kindergarten. But there's also sometimes other challenges that occur that might be child related. So other research has shown that when children are showing behavior problems in the classroom, that makes it much harder to navigate relationship building among teachers and parents. And so we kind of tried to keep all of these things in mind when we designed this set of practices that we implemented. And so I'm going to give the big caveat up front, which is we don't know if this works. This is another piece of research that got interrupted by COVID. But I do have some initial results to share that I think suggest that some of the mechanisms that we think matter are being impacted by this program. So we randomly assigned 52 classrooms to either receive the intervention or not. And we have data on almost 400 children and families. This sample is in multiple communities across Ohio. It is a racially and ethnically diverse sample. And it is a sample of families that earn very low income. So almost 80% of our families earn below 40,000, about a third were actually reporting household incomes of under 10,000. And so the one piece of data that we have to share so far is by the end of the preschool year, how were teachers viewing parents who participated in the program? And what we saw is that across racial and ethnic groups, parents who participated in this intervention program, particularly in the version of the intervention that included the home visits, were perceived as being more involved by their children's preschool teachers. We saw that these patterns were especially true for our Hispanic families, and that parents also reported better relationships with those parents as well. The comparison being between Hispanic parents who were assigned to be a part of the program and those who were not. So as I said, this is just some initial evidence that our theory of change is working, but I hope to have a lot more to share with you on this in the future. So to wrap up, I just want to leave with, I came up with these 3 C's that are the themes that seem to me to be really important to consider moving forward. And so they're connections, classroom experiences, and creativity. And so I think that the idea of connecting to families is always important, but it's more important now than ever. We've seen just huge amounts of increased family trauma and community trauma due to COVID-19, due to heightened racial tensions in our country. And then to some of the more long-term patterns that we've been seeing here in Ohio related to economic workforce conditions and opioid epidemics. And connecting with families might be harder than ever because of everything that's going on, but it also feels more critical than ever. But I also think that we're at this prime policy moment to increase these connections across systems with the new charge put in place by ESSA, but also by just this heightened interest in transitions. I think we're at a place where maybe we can get the resources and support needed to start building some of these cross-system connections. I want to go back to the idea of classroom experiences and how can we ensure that kids are getting what they need and what's developmentally appropriate for them, both in preschool and in kindergarten, in ways that are not going to heighten the challenges that they face during the transition. And this, again, I think goes back to the communication and the bring connections made across the preschool systems and the elementary system. But I want to end on this idea of creativity. I am not sitting here saying I have all of the answers. I think a lot of what I do have learned and do think really comes from talking to practitioners. And so I'm really excited about the potential for new creative solutions to emerge and to hopefully be researched so that we can figure out ways to make this transition better for children and families. So a few ideas to chew on. There is some qualitative evidence that when we do professional development that brings elementary teachers and teachers across all the preschool sectors in a community together and do that professional development together, that can lead to more alignment and smoother transitions. And so it's daunting to think about doing that given that ECE fragmentation, but it might be something that's worth really spending time on. Another thing I think about a lot is how do we change those first few months of kindergarten to make the transition more smooth and less abrupt for children? Maybe the end of kindergarten still looks more like first grade, but how can we make the initial months work a little bit better? And then how do we connect with families early on in meaningful ways that are going to matter? And I think, we're trying to do this in our intervention study, but I think there's still a lot to learn and a lot of room for new thoughts and ideas. So before I finish, I want to acknowledge our funding support from IES that has enabled us to do this work. But I want to really spend time acknowledging my collaborators. These people are the people that shape my ideas on this, that collect the data, that do a lot of the hard work. It really does take a village to do this type of work. When I was making these slides, I was convinced that I was forgetting a name to put on this slide, and I'm sure I forgot many, but one of the ones I forgot was Janelle Williamson, who introduced me earlier. So I want to make sure to add her on now because she was instrumental in collecting this data too. But with that, I'm really excited to take your questions. So feel free to use the Q&A and we can try to get through some questions now. But also feel free to shoot me an email with follow-up questions or to check out our website, both the work on the challenges that teachers are reporting kids facing in the kindergarten year and the work on the alignment of experiences from pre-K to K to grade 1 are all available, though both of those things are available in white papers that are on our website. So with that, I'm going to end and thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, awesome. We do have some questions here, so I'll go ahead and read the first one. The first says, have you had the opportunity to identify specific strong models of early childhood education programs and school age positively collaborating to support transitions and high quality educational practices?
So I think that's a really good question. And I would say, in general, no. So what I think from a systemic perspective, that Boston model I mentioned is the best example out there. But I also think that there are a lot of smaller examples where an elementary school or a preschool kind of takes it upon themselves to build these connections. And so it's happening at a much more localized level, and it really tends to be through kind of the sheer will of individuals to help build these connections. But I think we're really just starting to develop the like kind of bigger systemic models that we might be able to use to do this.
Awesome. Our next question is, what role can family involvement in early childhood education play in kindergarten transition to go along with these vertical alignment strategies?
So I think a few things. So one, we know that when there's open communication between parents and teachers, it serves children better. And so from a preschool, and we know that those relationships get challenged at the start to kindergarten. And it's for a variety of reasons. Some of them really just logistical about, you know, parents often have more contact with preschool teachers because drop off and pick up is happening for them before and after work. Whereas with elementary schools, they may not be there at the end of the day because they're still at work or things like that. But so I think that from a preschool perspective, helping parents to kind of build those connections and see the value in having connections with teachers and kind of helping them prepare to rebuild those connections as they go to elementary school is really important. I think engaging families has the potential to provide some continuity across this transition. So obviously the home and the classroom are very different experiences, but the more that everyone can be on the same page about expectations, the easier the transition may be. And then the last piece I think is really support. So I think the transition is hard for kids. And when it's hard for kids, it's hard for families. And so the more that we can think about, and again, I'm not being super specific here, I recognize that, but the more that we can kind of brainstorm ways that ECE teachers and then later elementary school teachers can help parents feel supported to kind of help their kids navigate this transition, I think that the easier it will be. So it does go back to kind of the communication and the connections.
That's great. And I'm really glad at the end you had the 3 C's that we can move forward with, both with families, practitioners, policymakers, all of that. Next question is, with the early learning and development standards up for revision in Ohio, do you think alignment will improve?
I hope so. I hope so. And I do hope so. I think it's hard. I think there are, this kind of academic focus that has started to occur in these early grades of elementary school hasn't come out of nowhere, right? It's come because that is kind of the direction that things have moved, both because of standards, but because of high stakes testing and a number of other kind of policy pushes that have occurred over the past decade. But I think one thing that I think about with the standards and more generally is thinking about how can we implement the standards in ways that promotes more alignment. So I think we often conflate academic goals and academic content with the methods that we're using for instruction or the groupings that we're using for instruction. And so if we can think about developing practices and using curricula that might help us maintain some of the academic focus that's really emphasized and required or mandated by the standards, but how to do that in ways that might rely more on small groups or be less teacher-led in some cases, or not happen through worksheets. I think kind of the methods of teaching might be another way to really get to alignment, even more so than the actual academic piece of the standards.
Wonderful. Next question is, Head Start is always willing to collaborate with school districts to strengthen collaboration on transition. How can we get buy-in from others to join our efforts?
Yeah, I agree. Head Start has always, it's consistently been on this. I'm glad for this question for a couple reasons. One, because I think it gives me an opportunity to make my disclaimer, which is I don't think that anyone is trying to make this transition hard or anyone is trying to not collaborate, but there are just so many barriers to doing it well. And so I think in terms of the specific question, I'm hopeful that these new ESSA requirements are going to open up more people to being engaged in this process. I don't think that school districts or non-Head Start preschools don't want to be a part of the district, but there aren't kind of the openings to do it, or it just hasn't been able to be high enough on the priority list given everything else that schools are dealing with. I think that because of ESSA, we might see more formal connections. But as I said, what I've really seen now is it really ends up being on a much more individualized level where the Head Start finds that one person in the elementary school that's going to help build those connections. And then I think recognizing that preschool and elementary school are different and that the goal is not to make one of them the other is really important and really hard, and something that I think we all need to think about. When we did these interviews, there are a lot of kindergarten teachers that think learning starts at the start of kindergarten and don't necessarily think about learning prior to. And there are a lot of preschool teachers that are really scared of the academic focus that has happened in kindergarten happening in preschool. And so I think that there's this natural kind of, not suspicion of one another, but there's those types of thoughts are not the types of thoughts that are going to make people feel the need to come together to kind of work on these issues. And I think as we're kind of moving beyond those thoughts and breaking down some of those barriers, I'm hopeful that we'll kind of see all of the partners, both the elementary schools, but also all of the different EC systems coming together.
Great, and we have just a couple practical questions about some of the data collection. So one related to Head Start, how many Head Start families were included in the data? And then also who were the home visitors working with the preschool teachers?
Sure. The amount of Head Start kind of varies across studies, but it's I can get those numbers for you from the white paper. It varies, but they comprised a substantial part of the sample in all of our studies. So we've always had Head Start classrooms in both the alignment work and in the transition work. And then the home visitors tended to be
people that we had hired from the communities that we were working in, many of them had backgrounds in early childhood education. And so one of our goals was to hire people who both kind of had experience from an ECE preschool perspective, but more importantly, had experience working with the communities that they'd be serving.
Awesome, thanks. The next question here is, how can local partners such as the library help with fostering relationships between home and classroom?
That's a great question. So I think that one way is kind of through direct programming, thinking about ways that they can be bringing families in that are with teachers potentially too. And maybe it's not their children's teachers or things like that, but they're kind of bringing in people from the perspectives of schooling and the perspective of parents to the same time to be doing things that may be learning related, but are also really designed to just be community events for people. So I think one of our underlying tenets for the work we've been doing is that building connections is going to lead to good things. And there's a variety of good things. And there are things you can add on to just building connections. So that would be, and that the libraries are great at that. And so that's kind of the first thing that comes to my mind, because that's what I think one of the library's big strengths are. But I think there's also ways that libraries could incorporate things, especially maybe for children that don't have access to more formal preschool options prior to kindergarten, doing some of these things. Or maybe it is having story time that is based on books about the kindergarten experience and giving kids and parents time to ask questions about what that is like, and things like that. That's one. I did not talk a lot today about kids who do not have any formal ECE experience prior to kindergarten. And that the number of families where that is the case is shrinking, but it is still something that we need to think about when we're thinking about the transition.
Awesome. And a couple of more questions about the data collection. Did the data on kindergarten classrooms come from whole day programs or half day? And then also, is the home visiting program still continuing?
Both. In terms of the kindergarten, it was mostly full day, I will say. But when we were there, we were designed to be there for the instructional time. Like we told teachers to tell us when they had an instructional block, and that is when we came. And then the home visiting program, yes, we're hoping to relaunch that program this fall. Yes. I will say I did see one chat question come through. I'm just going to take it really quickly, and it was about demographics of our studies. So in all of the data I presented, we had about 11% of our sample was English language learners, and then anywhere between like 10 and 15% were kids who had IEPs. So they were represented. Our goal was to include everyone possible in our studies, but they still were fairly small percentages of our overall samples.
Thanks for answering those and catching those coming through. One person is asking for access to the article where you reported the observed instructional practices and their frequency. I don't know if we can send that out later or parts of it out later.
Yeah, we can send the article out, and we also have the white paper has that too, and that's got the prettier graphics and the easier to read text. So I'm happy to provide both of those.
Awesome. We'll make sure those get distributed. Another question is, well, it's 1 o'clock, so do we want to keep going through, or?
I can do at least one more.
Okay. So this question is, what time of the year are the observations made? Is there a fall data set compared to spring? This might be an interesting place to better understand the transition between pre-K and K. So yeah, all those
Okay,
questions.
so that's a great question. So our data doesn't allow us to do that, at least in this data set. This is kind of like mid-year is the best way to describe it, like winter. I can tell you from talking to teachers, it seems like they try to do a few things, especially in the first few weeks, to help with the adjustment. Some of it is just related to kids being exhausted in the first few weeks of or kindergarten. But I think there's some other data that suggests not a ton is changing from fall to spring, but I do think that we need to start looking at a little bit more intensely in the future.
All right, we are at 1:01, so we'll make sure these questions are saved and we can reach out individually to folks if they have more questions. So thanks everyone for coming. And again, Kathy reminded us to, once you leave the event, you'll be directed to a very short survey. If you can fill that out, that'd be very helpful. So thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing more questions. Have a great one.